Today's daf we're going to be learning is Zevachim daf kapet. Today's daf is sponsored by the Hadran women of Long Island for a refuah shlema for Binyamin Yaakov ben Esther, betoch Shar Chalei Yisrael, husband of our daf friend and co-learner Sarah Seligson. May he and all others in need of healing experience a complete and speedy recovery. Today's daf is sponsored by Beth Balcony in honor of their granddaughter Devorah Chana Serach Eichel. May she grow up to be a lifelong learner. Okay, with that, we're going to get started. We started at the very end of yesterday's daf with a gufa. Okay, we're going to now go in depth into a halacha that we saw before about this idea. We're going to deal with a bunch of different issues about the kior, finish up that topic, move on to the uncircumcised person who does avoda, who's disqualified. We're continuing in the list of the Mishnah. From there, we're going to start the topic of the tameh, of an impure person, and get into a very interesting debate at the end of class between the elders of the South and Reish Lakish's harsh response to their radical opinion. So we're going to start with the kior. And we're going to deal with a bunch of different issues related to the kior. Okay, gufa. Amar Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina. Kol kior she'em bo kedei lekadesh arba'a kohanim mimenu. I'm at the bottom of Kaf Aleph Amud Bet. Ein mekadshim bo. Shene'amar v'chatzu mimenu Moshe v'Aaron u'banav. Remember we saw there was Moshe, Aaron, two of his sons. That's going to get us to 4 people. From there, we learned that the kior has to have enough water for 4 people to sanctify their hands and feet. Meitive. Now we're going to bring a contradiction to this because the Braita says, "Kol hakelim mekadshim ben sheyesh behem revi'it, ben she'en behem revi'it." You can use any sort of vessel for sanctification. The mekadshim here means it can mikadesh. You can do kiddush yadayim v'raglayim. You can wash your hands and feet from it. Whether it has a revi, which is a quarter of a log, which is much smaller than can wash 4 people's hands and feet. Right? That's usually the amount of like how much you need for kiddush. It's a very small amount. Ben she'en behem revi. Whether it has a revi, it doesn't even have to have a revi in it. Okay? You can use something very small. Ubilvad shu klei sharet. What's the one thing that's necessary? Has to be a sanctified vessel. That's all these vessels in the temple were sanctified. They anointed them, and that made them sanctified. Okay, we talk a lot about klei sharet. We'll talk a lot more about them throughout Zevachim and Menachot. So this vessel has to be sanctified, but it doesn't have to be big enough to have 4 people. So Amar of Adabar Acha bekodech betocho. Wait a minute. When we say they can wash their hands and feet from any sort of vessel, it doesn't matter how big it is. They're talking about, now here we have a machlokah Rashi Tosfot what this means. Ligdoach in Hebrew means to drill. So Rashi says it means that we're talking about you drilled a hole into, or some opening, unclear exactly how Rashi, the visual of this, but you somehow created, you put like a vessel that came out of, sort of goes from the kior, from the basin, into this other vessel. From there, you use it for washing. Tosfot seems a little more realistic, which is you actually took a vessel, you filled, you had the kior. You have to wash from the kior. The kior has to be big enough for, right, the basin has to be big enough for 4 people. But you can take some water out of the kior, as long as it's in a sanctified vessel, and then, in other words, just take it from there, like the way you take a pitcher of water onto your table and you use it for drinking, right, from the sink. So take from the basin some water in a sanctified vessel, and use it to wash. That vessel doesn't have to have a certain minimum amount. Okay, it doesn't have to be the 4 people. It doesn't even need a revi. As long as it's sanctified, that's enough. Okay, so that's how we resolve the contradiction. That's fine. Now, Gemara says, but wait, how can you say that you could wash from some other vessel? Veha mimenu amarachmana. And the pasuk that we saw before, right? Rachatzu mimenu Moshe Aaron ubanav. Mimenu means from it, from the basin. Right? It was the context of talking about the basin. To which they say, right, Yurchatzu lerabot klei sharet. Well, the next pasuk repeats something that really wasn't necessary. After it says, build the kior, right, and you're supposed to have, they put the kior in, and it's in the end of Shemot where it talks about they made the kior. And rachatzu mimenu, it's for the use for Moshe, Aaron, and his sons to wash their hands and their feet. Then it says, Bivo'am al Omoed, I'm in Shemot chapter 40, verse 32. When they come to Ol Moed, ubekirvatam on the Mizbech, when they get to the Mizbech, yirchatzu, then they will wash. So this word, they will wash again, it's just unnecessary. You could have just said, use this when they get to the altar, when they, Okay, but why yirchatzu? We already said rachatzu in the pasuk before. So while mimenu comes to say from the kiyor only, yirchatzu comes the rabo klei sharet. Another word of washing seems to say, oh, well, you could wash in some other way as well, through a klei sharet. Again, the klei sharet would have to come either it's attached directly to the kiyor, like Rashi says, or like Tosfot, it could at least just come from there. It doesn't have to be attached. But if the water in this vessel came from the basin, that would be fine. Well, the Gemara says, Ihachi. If it says yirchatzu and that comes to include some other method, klichol nami. Maybe you could use an unsanctified vessel. Why does it have to be sanctified? In other words, once you're saying that there's a word that comes to include other things, why don't we just say it includes anything? You can even use a non-sanctified vessel. So Amar Baye, klichol lo matzi. That doesn't make sense to say you could use an unsanctified vessel. Mikavachomer mikano. From the kavachomer, from the base of the basin. Now, the basin, you have to imagine, right? The basin is a basin. Okay, the Kohen has a nice picture of it, actually. You can also probably just look it up online, find a picture of the kior, of the basin in the temple. Anyway, it's this big, like sort of looks like an urn almost, although there's different kind of pictures of how exactly it looked. But it sat on a base. Now, the easiest way to imagine what this base looked like in theory, it's the way you have like the traditional Kiddush cup, I will say, right? Nowadays, Kiddush cups come in all different shapes and sizes. Traditional Kiddush cup has a base at the bottom that theoretically, if you were to turn it upside down, you could also use it to hold something, right? But because it's got what we call a beit kibul in the words of the Gemara, right? It has a place where you can accept things into. It's not flat, it's actually cupped, okay? But it's upside down and it's not used for wine, right? But if you wanted to, theoretically, you could put wine in it. So the base of the basin had something similar. Oh, thank you, Judy. In Shuli Mishkan's article, which I mentioned, she wrote about the kior. She has a picture of the kior. So there you have it on our site. You can find it in flashback this week. Find a picture of the kior. So now, Abaye says the following. The kano, okay, now we're going to read about the kano. Right now they're going to say something which you don't know where they get this from, but in a minute they'll tell you where they get it from. But ma kano shenim shachimo. Now, the kano, this base of the basin, was part of the basin. So it's a separate part. There were in two pieces. There was the base, and then there was the basin that it sat on top of. Now, it was also anointed, just like the basin was anointed. Also, the base of the basin was anointed. So therefore, ma kano shenim shachimo eno mekadesh. Now, if I put water in the basin, it becomes sanctified water, right? And I can use it for washing hands and feet. If I were to put water in the base of the basin, if I were to turn it upside down, like I talked about that Kiddush cup, if I turned it upside down and put in the base of the basin water, I could not use it. Eino mekadesh. How we know this, we're going to see in a minute. But right now, assume it's a given. You cannot wash with the water in the base of the basin. Klichol. So if the kano is actually anointed, it's a sanctified vessel, and yet you can't use it for sanctification of the hands and feet. Klichol she'inonim shachimo enodin she'ino mekadesh. So obviously, then a klichol, a non-sanctified vessel which was never anointed, of course you couldn't use it. If you can't use a kano, which is already sanctified, you obviously can't use a klichol which isn't sanctified. Okay. Soon we're going to sort of reject this, or at least offer a different issue. But right now, let's assume this is a given. Now, kano minala. How do we get to the kano? How do we know that you can't use it to sanctify your hands and feet, wash your hands and feet? The reason is, Ditanya, Rabbi Yehuda Omeo, Yachol Yehe Kano Makadesh Keder Shakior Makadesh. You might have thought you can use it for sanctification, just like you could use the kior. Again, you would have to turn it upside down. It doesn't, right? You can't use it the way it is. You would have to turn it upside down. But how do you know you can't? Talmud Lamal, va'asita kior nechoshet v'kano nechoshet. Now it says you make the kior out of nechoshet and you make the kano out of nechoshet. Now, here comes the issue. If you were writing that pasuk, what would you say? Vasita kior v'kano nechoshet. You would say you make the kior and the kano out of nechoshet. You wouldn't say you make the kior nechoshet and you make the kano nechoshet. So what's the drasha on this pasuk? Lenechoshet hikashiv l'lo davar achir. The only thing similar about the two is that they're made from the same material, but nothing else. Meaning you can't use it for the same purpose as the kior. That's how they get that you can't use the kano. If you can't use the kano, then you obviously can't use a klechol. But Amar le Marzutra Bereder of Mary the Ravina said, no, that's not a good proof. Because Malakano she'ain asoy letocho. Tomar b'klechol shasoy letocho. The reason you can't use a kano is because it's not, and the reason why we can't learn from there to a klechol is because the kano, and that's maybe you could say, fine, we learn it, asita kano kior nechoshet, kano nechoshet, you can't use it. But why can't you use it for sanctification of the waters, for, the kiddush yadayim v'raglayim, for washing? Because it's not meant to be a cleat that's used for holding things, just like the base of your kiddush cup is not meant for putting wine in. Nobody uses it for wine. So that's why it can't be used. But if you took a clay chol, which was meant for washing, like you have a washing cup or something, or a pitcher, why couldn't you use that? In other words, don't learn that from a kli that's not meant for being used for those purposes. So we're back to square one, which is if we're going to say your chatzu comes as mimenu comes to say only from the kior. All of a sudden, rachatzu seems your chatzu means you can wash from anything else. Why limit it only to clay sharet and not a clay chol? Maybe a non-sacred vessel should be able to work. So we're back to square one based on Marzutra. So now we're going to answer. Very kind of funny answer, but ela mimenu lemiute clay chol. Well, it does say mimenu. Mimenu comes to say only from the kior. Well, we extended it to mean other things. Well, we'll say not clay chol. Ihachi kli sharet nami. Again, if you're going to focus on mimenu kli sharet kior only, then and not kli chol, it should say also not kli sharet. So I said it's kind of silly answer, like we're kind of back to circling around, saying again, mimenu is limiting, limits not only kli chol, maybe it would limit everything, and we know that's not the case. So they say again, we keep just repeating, ha Rabbi Rahmana, your chatzu. Oh, because it says your chatzu, that includes kli sharet. Umareita, but again, this seems arbitrary. Now, it's not really so arbitrary. But what they're basically saying is, and we have this every time we do this, when there's a word that limits and a word that includes, and we're going to say, oh, it limits, not klei chol. It includes not only the kior, but also klei sharet. Why is that the one not included and not the one included? Here it's pretty obvious, but we're going to say it anyway. Because what's much more similar to the kior? The kior was anointed with the oil, the shemen hamishcha, and so were klei sharet. So it's gonna just make sense that if you're gonna say some vessels included, some utensil is not included, we're gonna include the one that's more similar to the kior, which is klei sharet, and we're gonna exclude klei chol. Okay, that was the first part of today's sugya, which was we have this issue of the kior. It should be enough for 4 people. But we see that you can actually use klei sharet. It doesn't, not that big. So how do we reconcile that? Well, the klei sharet somehow was coming from the kior. Then it's allowed, and that comes from the word yurchatsu, but you can't use a klei chol. Okay. Amar Reish Lakish. Another thing about the kior. Kol mashlim lemei mikveh, mashlim lemei kior. If you have a mikveh needs to be a certain minimum amount, 40 seah. If it's missing that amount, you can fill it in with other substances. Okay, you can't make it with those substances, but you can fill it in with those substances. Okay, so if it's missing some, you can add some of some other substance that's not water, right? Normally, mikveh needs to be water. You can use some other substances. Some of them are snow, hail, a bunch of other things. Okay, I mentioned the Mishnah and mikvaot, Perek Zayin, Mishnah Aleph. Whatever you could use to be mashlim and mikveh, you could also use if you're missing some amount of water, the minimum required amount for the basin. L'revi'it eino mashlim, but it doesn't work for the quarter log of water that we need for washing. Okay, so let's say you don't have enough water to wash, you can't stick snow in there. Okay, it doesn't work for the revi'it, for netilat yadayim. Okay, now, so Reish Lakish says this halacha, but he doesn't really say what specific items is he talking about that work for mei mikveh and mei kior to be mashlim, right? Now, they don't work to make a mikveh out of it, but they do work if you're missing some. But they don't work for revi'it. So we're going to have 3 possibilities. So the third one's going to work. The first 2 are not. Ilema, so lemiutemai. What are they excluding? Meaning excluding from you can't use for revi'it. Ma ilema lemiute titanidok. Maybe liquefied clay, okay, like basically water with some clay mixed in. Hechidami, what's the case? If it's more water than clay and a cow would bend down and drink from it, then afilu l'revi'inami. Then it would even work for revi because we're basically going to treat this as as water. Okay, this seems to be the litmus test. Does a cow bend down and drink from it? If a cow doesn't bend down and drink from it, then it's not going to work for a mikveh either. Ella, okay, this one is a very weird one, very, very hard to understand, although first I kind of struggle with this. Ella lemiute yavchushim adumim. If you want to say it's coming to exclude red gnats, okay, these are gnats that apparently they believed were created in the water, okay, and lived in the water, and therefore are treated like water, okay? Or if they're in a liquefied state or not, it seems like they're in a liquefied state. I don't really get it exactly, and neither do most of the commentaries. But anyway, afilu be'enai hunami. Even if the whole mikveh, this is what's hard to understand, the entire mikveh was liquefied gnats. Okay, let's just assume they're liquefied. Again, this sounds disgusting. You could theoretically use it as a mikveh because we're going to see this in a minute. Tahatanya, it says in a brighter, Shimon Gamli Alomel, Koshetchilat briato min hamayim matbilim bo. Anything that was created in the water, you can use for a mikveh. It's basically considered water. Okay, again, they had this belief in how things were created. Like we talked about spontaneous generation, and things kind of come out of the ground, they grow from the ground, and they are, like creatures. They believed that these were water creatures that were created in the water. This sounds disgusting. You could actually go into a mikveh that's full of liquefied eyes of a fish, okay? Because again, created in the water. And it's very hard to understand what they're talking about. But it's something that basically we treat like water. And that's completely water. Now, this source said you could be mashlim. You could fill in, not that you could use it as the base of your mikveh. So it can't be that. It can't be the first one. So Amara Papa, now we're going to have our answer. If I have a mikveh that's exactly 40 seah, and I take out a seah's worth, by the way, 40 seah is approximately, there's a debate about what it is, 332 or 570, I think, liters. Okay, so that's the size that we're talking about, 40 seah. If you're natan seah v'natal seah, let's say you take out a seah's worth. Of the 40, you take out a seah of water, and you put in something that generally can't be used for a mikveh. Okay, something that disqualifies a mikveh. But, okay, so you take out a seah and you put back in a seah of something else, of something that's generally not used for a mikveh. That you could do. So you can, and not only that, ditnan mikveh sheyesh bar ba'im seah. Here's the Mishnah about it. This is in mikveh Perek Zayim, Mishnah Bet, next Mishnah after that one about the snow and all those other things. Mikveh sheyesh bar ba'im seah mechuvanot, but it has exactly 40 seah. Natan seah v'natal seah, harei kasher. You take out a seah of water and you put in a seah of something else, it's fine. Okay. Now, just 1 second. Right. Right. Rashi says, like, we're talking about things like mei peirot, like fruit juice and any kind of water, mixture that's not really considered water, but somewhat. But Amar Rav Yehuda bar Shila, Amar Rabbi Asi, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, ad rubo. You could keep doing this until you get up to the majority, meaning you have to do under the majority. So you could do half. Half the mikveh could be this. Could be this other substance, as long as each time you take out a seah, put back in a seah. That's what you can't do with the revit mayim. You could do it with a mikveh, but you can't do it with your quarter log of water. Quarter log is very small, right? So you can't start doing that with a quarter log of water. Okay, that won't work. That you need for netilat yadayim. Okay? But Amar Rav Papa, there's different ways to understand the statement of Rav Papa, but I'll explain in one way. Im kadach bo revi'it. Again, we have this kadach, and again, Rashi and Tosfot have a disagreement what exactly this means. I'll give you both those options. Madbilim bo machatim v'tzinoriot. Okay, according to Rashi, kadach bo would mean if you had a mikveh, that you did this natan seah v'natal seah, and then you drilled a hole in the wall of the mikveh, and some of the water, like a quarter log, goes into that hole. And then, okay, let's say you drill a hole on the side near the top of the height of the mikveh, and the water streams in, because that's what happens. And then the water level drops, and there's no longer a connection between the mikveh and that side area in the wall. And you want to use that area, you can use it ladbil machatim b'tzinoriot, little, needles and very small things. You could use the mikveh. Now, usually you need a mikveh to be 40 seah. By Torah law, that's for humans, because humans have to fit in the mikveh. The whole body has to fit. for kelim, it could be smaller. However, the rabbi said, no, we're going to make all mikvaot 40 seah. However, this is a unique exception that if, now again, there's a bit of a debate what they're trying to say here. Does it mean you could use this as a kosher mikvah? Or does it because okay, now, what's the issue here? It came from another mikveh. So because of that, in other words, the water streamed in from a mikveh. Now, even though it's no longer connected to that mikveh, it still functions. We could use this as a mikveh, even though it doesn't have 40 se'ah anymore, because it came from a kosher mikveh, it's fine. Tosfot, by the way, says, like he said before, you could take it out. It didn't even have to be attached in the first place. You took it out of the mikveh, put it in some other vessel, you could use it as a mikveh for small items. Okay? But the point being here, again, there's a debate what the point is, but first of all, they say, because it came from a kosher mikveh. Now, also, is this relating to the natal se'ah and natan se'ah? In other words, even though revi, normally you can't have natan se'ah and natal se'ah, but if it came from a kosher mikveh that had this natan se'ah and natal se'ah, because the mikveh itself was kosher, and then you put the water off to the side here, right, that would be kosher. Also, that would be one case where revi would work with natal se'ah and natan se'ah, because it came from a mikveh that was already kosher. Okay, next issue with mekior. Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah Amar Reish Lakish. So Rabbi Yirmiyah quotes Reish Lakish. We're going to have a lot of Reish Lakish today. Okay, he was the one who said Mashlim Lemei Mikvah, Mashlim Lemei Kior, but not for Revi'it, which we just finished. Now Rabbi Yirmiyah says in the name of Reish Lakish, Mei Mikvah Kshirim Lemei Kior. You can take mikvah water, which is usually standing water, right, and then put it in, right, it's often made from rainwater, put it in the mei kior. So you can use mikvah water for the water in the basin. So the Gemara says, wait a minute. L'meimar, is he saying that lo mayim chayim ninu? That you don't need a spring water that's flowing? Don't you need that? Why do we think you need that? Well, v'hatanya, it says in a Braita. Here we're going off topic. This Braita is talking about, in Vayikra chapter 1, verse 13, it talks about how there's you bring a korban olah, the burnt offering. You have to rinse the pieces of the parts of the animal, certain parts of the animal, with water. So it says with water. Okay, Yerchatz b'mayim, wash with water. So there's a Braita that says, what does water mean? Okay, what do you think is water? Well, we're going to see. So they say, b'mayim, v'lo b'yayin, you can't use wine to wash it off. B'mayim, v'lo b'mazug, you can't even use diluted wine, which has water mixed in. B'mayim, l'rabot shar mayim. So first we talked about exclusions, now we're talking about including. This includes any kind of water. Here comes the big line that we're going to darshan. V'kal v'chomer lemei kior, and all the more so water from the kior. Now, why all the more so? My kal v'chomer lemei kior. Lav demayim chayim ninu. Is it not because that's flowing water? Now, that's water that came from a fresh spring, and that all the more so you could use. Forget about standing water, all the more so water that was fresh water. So they say, no, why do you assume that's what it means? And then that would contradict, obviously, Reish Lakish. Lo de kaddish. No, it means sanctified waters. That's because why? They were sanctified because they went in the basin, right? So because they're sanctified, all the more so you can use that. So the Gemara says, kaddish emal yuti. Who's to say that that's better because they're sanctified to use to wash the parts of the animal? V'hatana de Shmuel. And not only that, but we're going to say there's no way that that's what they mean. Why? Because in the Tana de Shmuel, there's Braita and that's the Shmuel that said, and from here we're moving to Amabet, Mayim she'en lahem shem levad. It has to be water that has no special name attached to it. Okay? Like Mekior, waters of the basin. Can't be waters of the basin, waters of the whatever, right? Like special waters. Yes. Mekior she'en lahem shem levad. Which means you can't even use Mekior. Okay, even though it said you could, which we're going to have to explain what does that mean. You can't even use mekior, okay, because it has a shem levai. It has a name that goes with the water. It has to be water, simple water, okay, not like, let's take our world, not bottled water, not sparkling water, right? Anything that has some sort of name attached to it, that doesn't work. Just plain water. So what does it mean then, kal v'chomer mekior? It sounded like you could use the mekior. It must be water that could potentially go into the mekior. In which case, we're definitely not talking about sanctified waters because that would have to be the water from the kior, which is it's not. So it must be alamayim chayim ninu. So we're back to square one with our question against Reish Lakish. It sounds like what it's saying is water, right? Plain water, clear, just water. And even water that comes from a spring, right? And there's all the more so water that comes from a spring, because that's obviously better water because it's fresh and it comes from a spring. So from there we see, how do we understand mei kior? Mei kior is water that could go in the mei kior, which means running fresh water. So now we're really stuck with Reish Lakish. So what's the best way to explain it? Oh, Tanaihi. You brought a Braita against Reish Lakish. Don't worry. It's a machloket Tanaim. And Reish Lakish can just say, I hold by a different opinion. Yeah, that Braita doesn't contradict me because there's two opinions about mei kior, whether it has to be running water, fresh spring water or not. That Braita holds is fresh spring water, and that's clear. But I hold by the other opinion. Now, it's not just that the Gemara is saying this, but we're going to prove this in Machloket Tanim. Amar Rabbi Yochanan said, mei kior, okay, when it comes to the topic of mei kior, water from the basin, Rabbi Yishmael omer mei ma'ayanhem, they come from a stream. Chachamim omer shar mei motem, it comes from other waters. You don't need it to be spring water. So basically, Reish Lakish will say, I hold like the rabbis, and the Braita is in the opinion of Rabbi Yishmael. And with that, we finished the topic of kior. So I'll just review this section at this point. So we started with the kior about being enough for four, right? It has to be enough for four people. We brought a contradiction to that, resolved it, right? Because we said, that's something that comes from out. You can also wash from something that comes out of the kior, either directly attached or even indirectly attached, as long as the water came from there. And from there, we said at least though it has to be from a clay sharet, and that we learned from the drosha Yurchatsu, includes clay sharet, doesn't include clay chol. From there, we went to Reish Lakish's statement, whatever is mashlim lemei mikveh, mashlim lemei kior, but not for a revi, which then, after two unsuccessful attempts, we explained it's specifically talking about the natan se'av and natal se'av. If you took out a se'av water from a completely kosher mikveh and put in a se'av some other liquid, right, like fruit juice or something. You could do that up until half, but you can't do that in a revi'ed. And then we just saw this one exception where you could, and then, right, if that revi'ed came from the mikveh. Then Rabbi Yirmiyah said, in the name of Reish Lakish, that made mikveh are kshirim lemei kior, which sounds like he doesn't require running water from a stream or from a spring, and it seemed from this Braita that it is. Ultimately, we resolved it by saying, it just means there's a machloket tanaim about this, and Reish Lakish just didn't hold by that tana. Okay, now we're moving to the arel. And this was the topic, by the way, this issue. We're going to get to arel basar and arel lev. And an arel lev is someone who decides not to be part of the religion. Okay, not necessarily related to circumcision. Okay, arel is someone who's not circumcised generally. So the topic of Daf Mishalahen is about this. Also, hopefully there'll be a gefet up. I know it's going to hopefully go up in Hebrew. We don't yet have the English, but hopefully the English will be coming. So that will go up in the next few days, God willing. Let's talk about this uncircumcised. We have an uncircumcised kohen who goes into the temple to do the avoda. His avoda is disqualified, just like all the others in the Mishnah. So Rashi there had said, we're talking about an arel who is uncircumcised because his brothers died from not being, right, from circumcision. And therefore, there's a chazaka in the family. The children die, and there's no obligation to a brit milah. Still, the kohen can't come into the temple. Okay, why Rashi brought that example, you're going to see by the end of this sugya. Okay, Amar Rav Chisda, davar zeh mitorah Moshe Rabbeinu lo lamadnu. Okay, the fact that an arel is disqualified when they do avoda in the temple, that his work is disqualified, right? The sacrifice is no good. This we did not learn from the Torah of Moshe. Okay, we've seen this phrase a lot of times. It comes up a lot. We actually learn halacha sometimes from Yechezkel. Okay, so we didn't learn it from Moshe. We learned it from Yechezkel. What's the pasuk? Chapter 44 of Yechezkel. We're going to first quote verse 9. Then we're going to go back to verse 7. Kol ben nechal. Okay, ben nechar sounds like a non-Jew, but we're going to see it doesn't mean a non-Jew. Arel lev, who is uncircumcised of the heart. Okay, we're going to see what that means, as I said before. Ve'arel basar, and one who's uncircumcised of the flesh, lo yavo al mikdashi l'sharteni. You are not allowed in the temple to go serve me. Okay, so that basically means they can't go in the temple. It doesn't necessarily mean the work is disqualified if they happen to go against that and go into the temple. How do we know their work they do in the temple is disqualified? This is two psukim before. B'nei nechar orle lev, orle basar liopim tashi, lechalel beiti. If you're to bring them, and they will desecrate my home. Okay, now it happens to be the continuation of the pasuk is bahakrivchem et lachmei chelev etc. As they sacrifice their things. So it seems clear. If they sacrifice, it will be desecrated. So that's how you get it. Now, Tana Rabbanan. Now we want to understand the terminology here. Ben nechar, ben nechar mamash. Maybe they're talking about Gentiles. Talmud lomar arel lev. No, that's why it says kol ben nechar arel lev. That goes together as one thing. It's a ben nechar. Okay, nakir is to be estranged. Okay, so generally we say that's someone who's outside the religion. This time it's going to be an arle lev. It's someone who's outside the religion because they chose to be. Okay, so that's why it says it's not talking about non-Jews, but it's talking about an arel lev, which is someone who left the religion, decided not to be Jewish. Im ke mata malomar ben nechar. So why does it call him a ben nechar then, which sounds like a non-Jew? Shenit nekru ma'asav laviv shebashamayim. His actions became estranged from God, okay, because he stopped practicing as a Jew. Now, ainli ela arei lev. So this comes to say, if there's a kohen who leaves the religion and then comes in the temple to do the sacrificial work, I don't know why he'd be doing that, but let's say he goes to do the sacrificial work, it will be disqualified. Arel basar minayin. How do we get arel basar then? Someone who's really not circumcised. Talmud lomar arel basar. Okay, well, that's pretty clear. It says uncircumcised of the flesh. Utsriche. Now, why do we need both to be written in the pasuk? You couldn't have learned one from the other. Why not? That person has a physical issue, right? There's foreskin on their body. That's a physical, that's considered despicable to have foreskin. But arel lev de lo mais emalo, but there's no physical blemish on the arel lev, so maybe they could come in. V'yesh min an arel lev mishum de'en libo l'shamayim. Now we finally get to the punchline where I'm going to go back to Rashi now. So an arel lev doesn't have his heart to the heavens. Aval arel basar dilibo l'shamayim emalo. But an arel basal, whose heart is to the heavens, meaning they're with God, they just can't be circumcised because of some physical issue. Emalo. So you might have thought not, and therefore you need that. By the way, some people say uncircumcised is also someone who doesn't do it because they're scared. Let's say the father didn't circumcise the child's older now, they're nervous to get a circumcision. It's another reason. They could still be libo l'shamayim, but they're not willing to undergo a circumcision, right? So it doesn't necessarily mean because you're uncircumcised, you're not with God. Okay, but this is probably why Rashi earlier says that we're talking about someone who didn't get circumcised because his brothers, because it's clear from the sugya that the arel basar is someone who is libo l'shamayim, is with God. Okay, his heart is with God. So basically, we couldn't have learned one from the other, and that's why the pasuk needs to mention both, because there are two different types of uncircumcised people. One is uncircumcised physically, one is uncircumcised spiritually. Okay, now we're going to move to Tamei Pasul, to a very interesting approach of the Ziknei Darom. Very surprising, and we're going to see Reish Lakish is also completely surprised by this approach, and we'll only get started with this today. Tamei Pasul. So the Mishnah says someone who's impure, who does work in the temple, is disqualified. We assume this means anyone who's Tamei for any reason. We know there's all types of ways of becoming Tamei. One is a sharet comes in contact with you. What do? You go to the mikveh that day, you wait for the sun to set. At the end of the day, you're already pure. If you're Tamei Mei, you have a 7-day process, and you have to do the sprinkling of the paraduma on day 3, on day 7, and only after that are you pure. You go to the mikveh again on day 7 in the morning, theoretically, and then you wait for the sunset, and you're good. And you have to do the sprinkling that day from the paraduma. Okay, which is more severe, obviously, right? Tamei Mei. Well, you might say obviously, but not what we're going to see here. So Ziknei Darom say, Amru Ziknei Darom, the elders of the south said, Lo shanu elet me sheretz. When we say a tamei who works in the temple is pasul, we're only talking about a kohen who's tamei tumat sheretz. Aval tamei meit, but a tamei meit is actually not allowed to work in the temple. But if a kohen is impure to a dead body, comes into the temple and does the avoda, his work is not disqualified. The sacrifice is still good. Why? Well, we learned already this concept of tuma'ahu b'tzibur. Tuma is permitted if the majority of the people are impure. Okay, the classic example is Korban Pesach, and we're going to get back to that. The majority of the people, because the Pesach Sheni is for individuals. Okay, if an individual is tamei mate on Pesach Rishon, they're pushed up to Pesach Sheni. But if the majority of the people are Tme'im on Pesach Rishon, we allow the Korban Pesach to be brought. Okay? Tuma hutra b'tzibur. We're going to permit Tuma when it affects the majority of the community for communal offerings. So because it's miratzeh b'tzibur, because Tuma is permitted in the tzibur for the community, well then if a miratzeh nami b'yachid, we're going to say, if a kohen comes into now there's no heter for too much sharets b'tzibur. If the majority of the people are sharets, there were, I don't know, a plague of creepy crawler creatures, they touched everybody. We wouldn't say, oh, you can all bring your korban. No, it's only for tumat mate. So he says, therefore, there's no ritzoi b'tzibur for tumat sheret. So that's the one that if the kohen were to do, the work would be disqualified. But tumat mate, no. So there's actually a logic to this. Okay, since there's a heter for tumat mate in tuma hutra b'tzibur, we'll say that the kohen who does it, again, should do it. But if he did it, his work his sacrifices aren't disqualified. Okay, so the Gemara now says, it doesn't make any sense. If you're going to say that tamei mate is miratzeh because it's miratzeh b'tzibur, so we'll allow it when the kohen does it, ihachi tamei sheretz nami leite b'kavachomer mitamei mate. Again, going back to how I started, you would normally say, well, if we're going to allow a kohen who, again, we're not going to allow him to come into the temple, but if he did it, we're going to say it's not disqualified. Then obviously too much sheretz, we're not going to disqualify his avoda. The chumrah they point out is that it needs sprinkling of the paraduma waters on day 3 and on day 7, and yet it's miratzeh b'tzibur, right? If the majority of the people are impure, and not only that, he's saying it's miratzeh for a kohen who comes into the temple. It's fine. Okay, kohen comes into the temple with tumat mate, does the avoda is fine. So tamei sheret she'ein tu'unas ash the shiur v'yein odin shemiratzeh. So then tumat sheret should also be by logic because it doesn't need hazan the 3rd day and the 7th day. So how are you going to explain that? In other words, obviously the Mishnah says tamei pasul. It's got to be some sort of tamei. According to the Ziknei Darom's logic, the tumat mate, because it's hutra b'tzibur, the kohen also is fine if he did it, that his work isn't disqualified. So we should conclude from there tumat sheret's not also. Now that obviously would be a ridiculous conclusion because the Mishnah says tamei pasul. We don't know then who would be included. So how do they explain the Ziknei Darom? Kasavir Ziknei Darom mechaprim kimit kaprim. He says the ones who atone for the people, that's the kohanim, are like the people. Meaning, okay, now we're going to explain. Ma mitkaprim. So now going back, tuma hutra b'tzibur. When is it hutra b'tzibur? Tamei mate in, tamei sheretz lo. Only for mate, not for sheretz. We're back to where we started. Af mechaprim tamei mate in, tamei sheretz lo. So in other words, he says, I'm ignoring your kavachomer because I have a different way of looking at it. Okay, the Ziknei Darom, or again, this is now putting words in their mouths. We don't know, but we're saying they're going to say the kohanim are just like the people, just like by Tuma Hutra B'tzibur, it's only tamei mate, not too much sheretz. Likewise, the disqualification of the kohen of the avoda is only from sheretz and not from mate, because the people are not disqualified by sheretz. I'm sorry, are the people? Sorry, I just said it wrong. The people are disqualified. It doesn't help if they're all tamei sheretz. They can't do the sacrifices. Likewise, the kohen who's tamei sheretz, if he does the sacrifices, they're disqualified. Whereas tamei mate, the people can do it, right? If the majority of the people are tamei mate, they can do it, and therefore also the kohen. If he did it, it's actually not disqualified. Okay, so far so good. Now the Gemara points out some other point about them, and that's going to raise a whole big question. So now they're going to say the following. Okay, so again, af mechaprim, likewise the kohanim, tamei mate in, tamei sheretz lo. Okay. My kasavri. Now, what do they hold about some other machloket? If you're standing on Yud Daled Nisan, that's the day we bring the Korban Pesach in the afternoon, and we eat it at night. Now, if you're tamei mate, what do we say? Pesach Sheni. You're tamei mate on Yud Daled, we say, do it on Pesach Sheni. Do it a month later. If you're tamei sheretz, you can go to the mikveh that morning, be pure by the nighttime. Can we do the Korban Pesach? Now, if you remember, the Korban Pesach, you have to be registered for the Korban Pesach. Can we register you for Korban Pesach and have other people take care of it for you because you're impure? But knowing that you can eat it at night because the sacrifice is brought during the day. Everybody eats it at night at Leila Seder. So can we do it for you? So now we're going to say the following. What does he hold about that? If he holds ein shochatim v'zorkim al tmei sharet, if he holds that if you're tmei sharet, we won't let people do the korban pesach on your behalf, and you're stuck without a plan. Amai lo avdei tzibur betuma. Well, then why won't he allow hutra b'tzibur if the majority of the tzibur is tamei sharet, which he obviously says you can't, right? That's what he says. The majority, that was his whole basis. Sharet is more chamor because it's not hutra b'tzibur. Now, why are these two together? Because this is what they say. Listen, this is the theory. Ha-kol shebiyachid nidche tzibur avdei betuma. That's what I said about the korban pesach. If an individual is pushed off to the next pesach, if the comparable case was the tzibur, because it's only individuals who go do a korban pesach, but if it's the tzibur, we're going to allow the korban pesach. So if the yachid is pushed off to Yudalid ER, that means that we're going to allow the tzibur in a parallel situation to bring the korban pesach on Yudalid Nisan if they're all tameh. But that's only going to be, now if he doesn't allow sherets for b'tzibur, then obviously he doesn't allow sherets to be pushed off, which means he must think that shochatim v'zorkin al shumat sherets. That's his theory. So, because there's this theory, again, I'm going to read it again. If a yachid is nidche, then the tzibur in a parallel situation would do it b'tumah. So therefore, since he doesn't allow the tzibur to do the tumat sherets, but tzibur, if they're all tamei sherets, he must hold that the yachid isn't pushed off, right? Obviously not pushed off to Pesach Sheni, therefore must be able to do the korban pesach on that day. Have someone do it for him or her, and then they'll eat the korban pesach that night. And therefore, ela kasavre shochtim v'zorkin al tamei sherets. Okay, that's just, we take as a given. He must hold, which seems to be the obvious, that someone, if you're tumat sherets on Yudala B'Nisan, we allow someone to slaughter and sprinkle the blood for you and do all the stuff of the korban on your behalf. You can be part of, can be appointed, counted in, registered for this korban pesach, and then eat with everyone at night because you're pure. Okay, that's pretty simple. But comes Ula and says, Amar Ula, Takale Reish Lakish Ledroma. Remember, Reish Lakish was lying on his stomach in the beginning of the Masachet and said, I don't get this Mishnah at all. He seems to have the same, now he's not lying on his stomach this time, but the same, he screams, I don't understand the Signei Darom at all. Okay? By the way, he was a lot on our page today, Reish Lakish, but this one is extreme. What are you talking about? This makes no sense. You said we're going to learn the kohanim from the people. But what's koach merubeh? Who has more koach to push off tuma? A kohen or the tzibur? Obviously the tzibur. Which means that the tzibur we're going to be more lenient with than the kohanim. So we're not going to learn the kohanim from the tzibur. If the tzibur can do it, then the kohanim can do it. So what's koach merubeh? Koach mechaprim or koach mitkaprim? Is it the people who atone for others, or is it the people who get atonement? Havei omer koach mitkaprim. Okay, so the tzibur has a lot more ability to allow tuma. Why? Well, we're going to see right now. Now, what we just said, based on what we just said, the Gnei Darom must hold that Mishachim Korbonotehem if they're Tumat Sheret. So if I'm Tumat Sheret on 14th of Nisan, I can have someone do the Korban for me. That means the Mechaprim are able to do things that the Kohen can't. Because Kohen who's Tumat Sheret, of course, can't go into the temple on the 14th and do the Avoda. Okay, you get it? So that's going to be their logic. How do we know, right? If they're obviously more lenient, because if they're tumei sherets, then basically they can send someone to do the korban for them. But kohen shenitma b'sheretz, who comes into the temple and does the avoda, what did the Zignei Darom say? He's just quoting back the Zignei Darom. On the one hand, you hold, which again, they never said this, but we assume that they must hold this based on the last thing we just said, which is you have to come to the conclusion that the sherets that mishachim korbonotehem, someone who's tamei sherets and Yudala b'Nisan, they would send their korban for them. They would register them. And a kohen shenitma b'sheretz, your whole theory was, what is the tamei? That's pasul. It's a tamei tumat sheret. So that obviously shows that the kohen is more strict than the people, which means, here comes the logic of Reish Lakish that basically says you're totally wrong. Ziknei Darom. Makom shenitma'u ba'alim b'meit. If the people are all, the tzibur is tamei made on Erev Pesach, what do? We bring the korban, right? Well, according to your logic, right, this logic, right, sorry, I didn't say this right, my mistake. If an individual is tumat made on your dalid, what do we say? It's more severe, right? Then, and as well, Zignei Darom wanted to say sharet is more severe because it's not a trabat tzibur. But if you look on a yachid basis, if you have someone who's nitma ba'alim b'meit, an individual on your dalid, you can't send your korban. What do? You do pesach sheni. So what do we say? Kohen shenitma b'meit eino din she'eino meratzeh. So obviously a kohen can't get atonement if he's tumat meit. So how do we say that his korban is accepted? How did you say the Zignei Darom? His korban is accepted if he's tamei meit. Okay, now this assumes something which obviously, if you're tamei meit, what do? You do it on Pesach Sheni. You can't do your korban that night. If you're tamei sharet, you could do your korban right that day. You can have someone bring it for you and eat that night. If you're tamei meit, you have to push it off a month. So obviously, if we're going to say then the kohanim were more severe in the sharet's case, their work is disqualified if they're sharets, then obviously their work is going to be disqualified if they're tamei meit. And that goes completely against what the Zignei Darom said. To resolve this, the Gemara suggests something very radical. Okay, and this is going to be the big topic of the beginning of tomorrow's daf, which is Kasavri Zignei Darom Tamei Meit Nami Mishalech Korbonotav. Zignei Darom hold that if you're standing on your dalit and you're tamei meit, you have a choice. You can either wait till Pesach Sheni, or you can be registered on a Korban Pesach and have them do it for you. And even though you're not going to eat the meat, you can be Yotzei. It's a crazy idea. Radical. What do you mean? The Torah says, and that's what the Gemara's first question is. It says, if you're a tamei meit on Erev Pesach, you push it off. You don't do it now. So how could the Zignei Darom hold that you do it now? In other words, to break Reish Lakish's kavachomer, they assume that the Zignei Darom must hold that just like you could do for sharet, you could also do for tamei meit. And then that puts sharets and tamei meit in the same category. And that's why you could theoretically say only sharets, the kohen's tamei, the kohen's avoda is pasul, and not for tamei meit. Okay? That's a radical position. So how do we resolve the fact that it says do Pesach Sheni? Mitzvah. Ideally, do Pesach Sheni, but you really want to do Pesach Rishon? Just register on someone's Korban Pesach, let them do it for you. Don't come to the temple, don't eat the meat, and you're good. You're covered. Crazy radical idea. We're going to get into more questions about this in tomorrow's daf. Here we're going to stop. So the second part of today's daf was the arel, and then we moved into the tamei, and we had this radical position of the Zignei Darom that it's only tamei sharetz, not tamei meit. Tamei meit, kohen who works in the temple, actually his work is accepted, which is crazy to think. And that's what Reish Lakish says. This makes no sense. And it leads us to say they must have even more radical positions than we thought by thinking that someone could actually send their korban Pesach on Pesach Rishon, have someone take care of it for them, even if they're impure to a dead body. That's where we're going to finish today. Wishing everyone Chag Sameach. Okay, we're the wrong Erev Chag, but we are Erev Chag Sukkot. Wishing everyone a Chag Sameach, and we'll meet up after Chag. And tomorrow's daf will go up soon this morning.